And the chair of the Defence Select Committee, Rory Stewart, joins me now. Welcome to the Sunday Politics. Now, you were against military intervention in Syria in 2013. Why have you changed your mind?
I actually feel very, very strongly that this is a mess getting completely out of control, and that there are very useful, concrete things we can do on Sunni tribes, on regional players, and particularly Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and even internally in terms of the Shia militia in Iraq.
But in your report, you talk now of the threat IS poses, the terrorist threat, regional destabilization, countries being destabilized as well, like Jordan. But only 18 months ago, you wrote, if we allow ourselves now in Syria to talk up fears of terrorists, Iran, regional security, one rocket attack will lead to another, then to ground troops, then to nation building, then an inability to leave. Were you wrong?
Andrew, you're completely right to pose those, and I think the challenge for somebody like me, but I think for all of us, is to find a middle ground. So what we're trying to avoid is repeating the mistakes of Iraq and Afghanistan in 2001, 2003. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we need to lurch to complete isolation. So to return to what you just quoted me on, I think it's true. We should not be dragged into a ground war. We shouldn't be sucked ever deeper, but we shouldn't go to the other extreme of isolation. The only way we're going to deal with all of this, doesn't matter whether we're talking about Russia, Ukraine, or whether we're talking about Iraq, Syria, or whether we're talking about Libya, or whether we're talking about Yemen, is working out how to play a constructive role.
But you describe in your report our contribution to the Allied effort against IS in Syria as, quote, strikingly modest. But maybe that's because after all the cuts politicians have enforced on our military, that our military resources are now pretty modest.
That is a problem. But I think it's also a question of whether we really want to get involved, even modestly. I mean, we could do with 200-300 people on the ground, really focused on understanding what's happening with the Sunni tribes, what's happening with the Shia militia. That's not very expensive. That's about understanding, it's about intelligence, it's about shaping plans and missions. It's about Britain playing a more active role.
Haven't you underestimated our contribution? Defence Secretary Fallon says that we've carried out the second highest number of airstrikes. Only America has done more. This week there have been daily Reaper drone strikes, 12 tornado sorties, 22 refueling missions.
It's true that we are the second largest contributor, but it's also true, of course, that the United States, at the point at which we last got the statistics, have done so many of those strikes. We found out that it turned out that we'd done about 6% of those strikes.
It's still the second highest. Yet you compare us unfavourably to Italy, Australia, Germany, Spain.
But Andrew, I guess the key is not airstrikes. The solution to Iraq isn't going to lie in that. So counting numbers on airstrikes is a bit of a distraction. The question
well, except you counted them and said it was only 6%. But that was a misleading figure, wasn't it?
Andrew, I can get into the figures. The answer was we found 99 strikes, but I don't want to get into the statistics of this. It was 99 against 1,600. But the key question is the politics of this. If we become a country that judges and measures our performance just on airstrikes, we're going to miss the key. The key is, why do people support the Islamic State? Why are the Shia militia who back the Baghdad government alienating so many people? These are the issues we need to grip. This isn't going to be something solved by airstrikes. So, of course we disagree, or we seem to disagree with the government about the figures on airstrikes, but that's not the key.
But we're also helping the Peshmerga. We're helping to train them. We've helped to give them some arms along with other countries. And last time I looked, the Peshmerga, the Kurds, were winning.
So, Andrew, once more, the key is not this. It's not whether we're giving 40 machine guns to the Peshmerga or whether we're doing airstrikes. The question is the Iraqi government going to be able to retake Western Iraq, Mosul, Fallujah, Tikrit? What are the Shia militia going to do? Why are the Sunni tribes backing them? That's what we need to understand. Britain needs a mission, it needs a strategy, it needs a deep understanding of the American plan. This is another thing.
Well, do the Americans have a plan?
Well, we barely are in a position to even judge that because we don't have enough people on the ground. We have, currently, when we were on the last committee trip, we found 26 empty pods, accommodation blocks in the embassy in Baghdad, which were fully paid for and which weren't occupied. So the first thing we need is people to analyze the situation, look at that plan, look at the Iraqi plan, the American plan, and shape it. That's what we used to do.
Well,
we used to do that in Afghanistan, we used to do that in Iraq. We don't seem to be doing that again.
Your report criticizes the government for failing to set out a clear strategy or a definition of our role. So what should the strategy be?
So the strategy, I believe, has to be fundamentally about three things. It has to be about prizing the Sunni tribal community away from the Islamic State. It has to be about getting the Shia militia under control, which stops the Baghdad government from being toxic, and it has to be, thirdly, about a regional solution. But the key thing is this. Those are very easy things to say. They're banal things that everybody... And the key is that unless you have the people on the ground who can tell the difference between the Jaburi tribe and the Janubi tribe, we're not talking about boots on the ground, unless you have people who work out exactly what Al-Amri is doing with the Badr brigades, which is one of the big Shia militias, unless you can understand what the dynamics are in Turkey, we won't know what the options are. Are we containing? Are we eliminating? Are we going to Tikrit first? Are we coming up?
But I would suggest to you that's overwhelmingly a matter for the Americans. We were never, after 2003, big in Baghdad or in western Iraq. Our sphere of influence was Basra, where we didn't do very well. Indeed, many people think we got out with our tail between our legs. If that's the right strategy, that is overwhelmingly a job for America, in which we would have no more than a walk-on part.
Two things, Andrew. Firstly, we played a very active part, particularly in the Sunni outreach in 2007, 2008. Secondly, the British public cannot be in a position where we're simply signing up to a plan that we do not fully understand, that we can't fully analyze or at least attempt to influence.
You want to get rid of Assad, the Assad regime in Syria, and you want us to take on IS. I would suggest to you that we can't defeat Assad and defeat IS. It's one or the other, not both.
You're right that those two people are fighting each other. And we also have huge problems elsewhere in the world. So I think we have to start with realism. No boots on the ground, no attempt to pretend we have
universal solutions. Except special forces, you want them on the ground.
Oh, Andrew, yes. And I think, though, again, to come back to the bigger issue, it's about Britain being a serious country. Britain having a granular understanding of what's happening. We have a real reputation with Arabists. We have over 10 years' experience directly on the ground there. We are the fifth largest economy in the world. We have an enormous defense budget. We're a permanent member of the Security Council UN. Britain should be leaning into these.
I mean, you seem to suggest that simply if we had more knowledge, we'd be in a better position. We had the Camel Corps in all its glory in the Foreign Office in 1956. We still made a complete Horlicks of Suez. But I want to ask you a more general issue. I mean, you want to take a strategic look. I mean, this is above all, it's a Sunni-Shia struggle that's going on in the Middle East now. It's the Middle East version of the 30 Years' War. Do we really want to get involved in that?
Andrew, we cannot believe that just by stepping back and pretending it's not happening, things are going to get better. The real lesson of the last 3 years in Libya and in Syria is that stepping back and pretending these things aren't happening doesn't improve things. That was a fantasy that many of us developed in 2001, 2003. We were wrong. It turns out that over-intervention causes problems, but you get an equal number of problems from doing nothing. As for this Sunni-Shia split, we can't allow it to be reduced simply to those terms. There are many other things going on. Very bad government, tribal politics, horrendous atrocities conducted by militias. This isn't just any more than the Balkans War was just about Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians disliking each other. This can't be reduced to sectarian hatred. A lot of this is political.
But it is driven by sectarian hatred, and one of the things it's done is it has de facto partitioned Iraq. It surely cannot be an aim of British foreign policy to preserve Iraq, which was, after all, an artificial construction, which we know because we constructed it in the First World War. It's not our aim of policy, is it, to keep Iraq intact?
So the central aim, you're right, of the British, American and other governments over the last 10 years has been to try to hold the country together. But you're also right that one of the reasons we need to understand the situation better is if the divisions get so extreme between the Kurdish areas and even between Arab Sunni and Arab Shia, it may be necessary to look at some other arrangement, a confederal arrangement. Now, again,
well, the Kurds are always there, aren't they?
Again, you and I are not in a position to decide from London what the answer to that is. That's why we need hundreds of people on the ground with the granular knowledge to be able to lay out those options, to talk about what the risks are, what the costs, what the benefits are of those different models.
But I would put it that you're swimming in seas that are not conducive to what you want to do, because in this country there's no great public appetite for greater involvement in this. I mean, the 2003 Iraq invasion, I would suggest to you, it hangs over British attitudes in the same way that Vietnam conditioned America for a generation.
You're absolutely right. One of the biggest problems here is that Iraq seems to have traumatized a whole generation. But Britain needs to rediscover its confidence. We need to rediscover our seriousness. We aren't, to be blunt, Denmark. We are a major power with serious knowledge and competence. And if the Middle East collapses, and if 20,000 foreign fighters turn up in ISIL, that is a big, big threat to Britain. So we can't allow ourselves the luxury of lurching from over-involvement to isolation.
Now, you've written, very interesting, you say Britain is currently a very paralyzed state. There's a deep insecurity and anxiety. We're not pulling enough weight in NATO, we're not pulling enough weight in the UN, we're failing to commit ourselves to spending 2% of our GDP on defense. We need to recover our compassion, our common sense, our confidence. That's a pretty damning critique of the foreign policy of a Conservative-led government.
This was a speech I made in the House of Commons, so I'm glad that you saw it. But I think a lot of those things are key. The 2% is really key. If we look at Russia and Ukraine at the moment, Putin is testing us. He's testing our resolve. He wants to work out whether NATO is serious. One of the biggest indicators on that is we committed in the Wales summit to spend 2% of GDP on defence. We've encouraged lots of other countries to do the same thing.
Why won't Mr. Cameron, and again Mr. Osborne this morning, why won't they commit to 2% of GDP on defence if they're in power between now and 2020?
At the moment they're saying that they will spend it to 2016, but I agree with you. We need a manifesto commitment that lays out a long-term obligation. Now this is partly to do, I believe, with people thinking the British public isn't interested in defence, isn't interested in foreign affairs. The world is more dangerous now than it has been for the last 20 years. And we've just talked about Syria, Iraq, we've talked about Ukraine. We haven't begun to talk about Libya. We haven't begun to talk about Yemen.
Let me stop you there, but let me invite you back to talk about all of these things and more.
Thank you.
Rory